All right, so picture this. You're running a software company, things are going great, but then you decide to take a big gamble. You're going to put a huge chunk of the company's cash, not into like new software or anything, but into Bitcoin. Sounds a little risky, right? Well, that's exactly what Michael Saylor, the head of MicroStrategy, did.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story.
It really is. And in this deep dive, we're going to take a look at a recent report about MicroStrategy, their journey, and what it all means for investors. You know, especially those who are wondering, is this guy a genius or is he just gambling with the company's future?
Well, and the thing is, MicroStrategy wasn't always a Bitcoin company, right? Like you said, they started out as a pretty standard enterprise software company.
Right, totally.
But then in 2020, Saylor just decided to flip the script. He saw Bitcoin as this potential safe haven from inflation and all the economic uncertainty at the time. Remember, interest rates were super low back then?
Yeah, it was like everyone was trying to find a place to put their money where inflation wouldn't just eat it all away.
Yeah.
So Saylor decides to basically turn MicroStrategy into the world's first Bitcoin treasury company.
And that's a really important distinction because what he was doing was fundamentally different from just using Bitcoin for transactions. They were hoarding it, like as a long-term store value, almost like a digital gold.
Oh, interesting.
It was a huge gamble, though, because, you know, back then, Bitcoin was even more volatile than it is now.
And you can't really talk about this gamble without talking about Saylor himself. I mean, this guy has become a total Bitcoin evangelist. He's constantly talking about it on social media, at conferences, doing interviews. Everywhere he goes, it's all Bitcoin all the time. Some people think he's a visionary, you know, ahead of the curve. Others think he's reckless, maybe even a bit of a showman, risking his company for a bet that might not pay off.
It's really fascinating how much his personality has influenced how people see MicroStrategy. I mean, they're practically synonymous with Bitcoin now, and it's attracted a whole new class of investors, people who are all in on Bitcoin and believe in Saylor's vision.
Okay, so let's get down to the numbers. As of the third quarter this year, MicroStrategy is holding a mind-boggling 252,220 Bitcoins. And with Bitcoin trading at around $72,000, that's worth about $16 billion. They initially invested $9.9 billion. So yeah, they're sitting on some pretty significant unrealized profits.
Yeah, they are. And to track all this growth, they use this metric called BTC yield, which is basically supposed to show how much their Bitcoin holdings are growing compared to their share count. For Q3, it was 5.1%, and year-to-date, it's a whopping 17.8%.
Okay, but wait a second. Doesn't that sound a little misleading? It's like someone bragging about how much weight they lost just by drinking tons of water, but completely ignoring the fact that they also ate an entire cake. Doesn't this BTC yield thing totally ignore all the massive debt they've taken on to buy all this Bitcoin?
You're right. It's one of the big criticisms of the metric. It doesn't take their debt into account at all, which is a pretty big oversight.
So they've made a big bet, and so far it looks like it's paying off. But here's where things get even crazier. Saylor isn't content with just holding all this Bitcoin. He's got this new plan. He calls it the 21-21 plan. And it's bold, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about raising $42 billion over the next 3 years to buy even more Bitcoin. They plan to do it through a mix of equity offerings and fixed income securities.
So basically, they're issuing more shares and taking on even more debt.
Yeah, it gets kind of complicated, but they're basically using things like convertible notes.
Okay, so wait. Hold on. Explain that a little bit.
So basically think of it like a special kind of loan that can actually turn into company shares down the line. And if that happens, it could dilute the value of existing shares. So it's a way to raise money fast, but it comes with some potential downsides.
So they're doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on their Bitcoin bet. It's clear that Saylor has complete faith in the future of Bitcoin. But what about MicroStrategy's original business? You know, their bread and butter, the software. What's happening with that?
Well, that's where things start to get a little worrisome. Their core software business is actually shrinking. Total revenue is down 10.3% year over year.
Woo. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not a good sign. Are they just neglecting their original business? Could this be a sign of trouble, even if Bitcoin is doing well?
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. And when you dig deeper, it gets even more interesting. Their subscription services revenue is actually up, but revenue from product licenses is down.
That's interesting.
It tells us they're shifting their focus, but it raises the question, can they really rely so heavily on just one asset, especially one as volatile as Bitcoin?
We'll be back after a quick break to discuss that very question in more detail.
I mean, it's like putting all their eggs in one very volatile basket.
And let's face it, the cryptocurrency market is basically a roller coaster on steroids. So what could go wrong here? What are the risks with this Bitcoin-centric strategy?
Well, I think the biggest one is pretty obvious. Bitcoin's price could crash.
Right.
And if that happens, MicroStrategy could be in big trouble,
No.
especially with all that debt they've taken on.
Yeah.
They might even be forced to sell off their Bitcoin at a loss,
Ouch.
which would be bad news for their bottom line.
Definitely. And let's not forget that their stock price is basically tied to Bitcoin at this point.
Right.
If Bitcoin goes up, their stock goes up. If Bitcoin tanks, their stock tanks. It's almost like they've become a Bitcoin ETF instead of a software company.
Exactly. They're extremely vulnerable to any swings in the market. And with all the debt they're using to buy Bitcoin, that risk is only amplified. It's a pretty delicate balancing act.
And to make things even more interesting, interest rates are starting to rise.
Yeah.
Isn't that going to make it even tougher for them to manage all that debt?
Oh, absolutely. Higher interest rates mean higher borrowing costs, which can put a lot of strain on their finances.
So let's get back to the big question. Is Michael Saylor a visionary, or is he a gambler? He's made some bold moves, and so far they've paid off. But is this whole thing too risky? Is he betting too much on one single volatile asset?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He could go down in history as a genius who saw the potential of Bitcoin before everyone else. Or he could be a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the smartest people can get caught up in the hype and take on way too much risk.
It's a wild story, and it's not over yet. So what are your thoughts? What do you make of Saylor's strategy and the future of MicroStrategy?
Honestly, it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's exciting because they're really pushing the boundaries of traditional finance, exploring new possibilities. But it's also terrifying because the level of risk they're taking on is almost unheard of in the corporate world.
It's like watching a high-stakes poker game unfold in real time. And the stakes just keep getting higher and higher.
Yeah.
But the question is, are they going to win big or lose it all?
Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure. MicroStrategy's story is a fascinating case study in risk and reward. And it's a good reminder that in the world of investing, nothing is guaranteed.
So what does all this mean for our listener? You're listening to this deep dive, maybe thinking about investing in MicroStrategy and Bitcoin, or just trying to understand this whole crazy world of cryptocurrency. What's the takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that you need to be informed. Before you make any investment decisions, especially with something as volatile as cryptocurrency, do your research. Understand the risks, understand the potential rewards, and most importantly, understand your own risk tolerance.
That's so important. Don't just jump on the bandwagon because someone like Michael Saylor is saying Bitcoin is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Take the time to really learn about it, understand it, and make an informed decision based on your own personal situation.
Exactly. And always remember, any investment can go up or down. There are no guarantees in the market, especially when it comes to cryptocurrency.
Well said. So if you were an investor, would you bet on MicroStrategy and Saylor's Bitcoin-centric vision? Or does this whole thing seem way too risky for you?
Well, that's a question only you can answer. But hopefully this deep dive has given you the information you need to start thinking critically about MicroStrategy, about Bitcoin, and about the future of corporate finance.
Absolutely. And that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to give you the tools to think for yourself.
And to hopefully make the process of learning about these complex topics a little bit more engaging and maybe even a little bit fun.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one last thing I wanted to touch on that didn't really come up in the report. It's about the environmental impact of Bitcoin. All this Bitcoin mining. It takes a ton of energy. And a lot of that energy comes from fossil fuels. Some people are saying that's a major problem, that Bitcoin is actually contributing to climate change. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's definitely something that any responsible investor should think about. Bitcoin's energy consumption is a big concern. There are a lot of different estimates out there. But it's clear that mining Bitcoin uses a lot of electricity, like more than some entire countries. And a lot of that electricity is coming from sources that aren't exactly environmentally friendly.
So is there any way to make Bitcoin more sustainable? Like, are there any solutions in the works?
Well, there are definitely some efforts being made to switch over to renewable energy sources for Bitcoin mining. Some companies are using solar and wind power, even hydroelectric. And there are some new technologies being developed that could make the mining process itself more efficient.
So it sounds like MicroStrategy's Bitcoin bet isn't just a financial gamble. It's kind of an environmental gamble, too.
Right. They're betting that Bitcoin will become more sustainable, or that the environmental concerns will eventually be outweighed by the benefits of the technology.
It's a lot to consider, for sure. But that's what makes this whole story so interesting. MicroStrategy's journey is like a microcosm of this whole bigger debate about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and the future of finance.
Yeah.
It's a story with high stakes, big questions, and definitely no easy answers.
And that's exactly why it's so important to have these conversations, to look at these issues from different perspectives and encourage critical thinking. The world of finance is changing so quickly. It's up to all of us to stay informed and make smart decisions about how we want to be a part of it.
Well said. So there you have it, our deep dive into MicroStrategy and their big Bitcoin bet. It's a story of risk, reward, innovation, controversy, and uncertainty. And it's a story that's still unfolding. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the ideas that are shaping our world.